Good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Francesca Bregoli. I am the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the Graduate Center. I want to welcome you all. Thank you for joining us for the second roundtable on the current debate over definitions of anti-Semitism and their implications for activists, politicians, university officials, and the general public. Today, we are hosting a conversation that will explore the impact of these definitions, the IHRA definition, the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism, and the Nexus document on college campuses and in the public arena. We're delighted to welcome three influential scholars who have made key contributions on this discussion: Katz, Pamela Nadell, and Avinoam Patt. The debate on defining anti-Semitism has been brought back to the attention of the wider public this year, of course, after the House passed the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act in the spring. And discussions over defining anti-Semitism have also been very prominent on the mind of university administrators, professors, students, and their parents in recent months. We're all aware of the spike of anti-Semitic incidents that have occurred on US college campuses and beyond in the wake of the war in Gaza. At CUNY, the recent report by Jonathan Lippman, commissioned by Governor Kathy Hochul, found that our university system has not handled effectively the rise of anti-Semitic and discriminatory incidents. It recommends relying on the IHRA definition as a vital resource. This confirms CUNY practice since 2022, while also stating that the report does not, or Lippman does not believe that CUNY need adopt a definition of anti-Semitism, let alone any specific definition of anti-Semitism. Today, we're going to address several questions, proceeding from the ways in which our speakers have thought carefully and extensively about the threat of anti-Semitism and how these concerns are being discussed and addressed at their institutions. As always, I want to extend my thanks to Marty Elsky, who first suggested hosting a conversation on this topical and complex issue, as well as to the GC Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity, which is co-sponsoring this event. The program will begin with a round of initial prepared remarks from our speakers, followed by a conversation. We will conclude with a selection of questions from the public at home. I invite you to please use the Q&A tool on Zoom to type in your questions, and we will select a number of questions based on the time that we have for the Q&A. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to introduce all our speakers together in the order in which they will present their initial remarks. Katz is Associate Professor in the Department of History and Faculty Director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. A scholar of the modern Jewish experience, he focuses particularly on the history of France and the Francophone world. He is the co-founder of the Antisemitism Education Initiative at Berkeley, which has garnered national acclaim and is regularly consulted about how to raise awareness and create trainings for other campuses across the country. Professor Katz is the author or co-editor of 4 books, including The Burdens of Brotherhood, Jews and Muslims from North Africa to France, which came out for Harvard in 2015. And he is currently completing a new book entitled Jews and Other Strangers, Dilemmas of Zionism, Colonialism, and Antisemitism. Avinoam Patt is the Maurice Greenberg Professor of Holocaust Studies at New York University, where he also serves as director of the Center for the Study of Antisemitism. Dr. Patt previously held the Doris and Simon Conover Chair of Judaic Studies at the University of Connecticut, where he served as director of the Center for Judaic Studies and created the large-scale online class Why the Jews? Confronting Antisemitism, which reached over 1,600 students in the first semester it was offered. He is the author of multiple books on Jewish responses to the Holocaust, including The Jewish Heroes of Warsaw, The Afterlife of the Revolt, which came out for Wayne University Press in 2021. And his newest book, Israel and the Holocaust, was published this year by Bloomsbury Press as part of its perspectives on the Holocaust. Pamela Nadell is the Patrick Clendenin Chair in Women's and Gender History and Director of the Jewish Studies Program at American University. She is the author of many books, including most recently, America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, Norton 2019, which was named Jewish Book of the Year by the Jewish Book Council, and Women Who Would Be Rabbis, A History of Women's Ordination, 1889-1985, Beacon Press, 1998. She consults for museums, lectures widely, frequently appears on podcasts, and has written for, among others, The Washington Post, The Conversation, and Hadassah Magazine. She's a past president of the Association for Jewish Studies. In 2017 and 2023, she testified before Congress about anti-Semitism on college campuses. Her next book, Antisemitism, An American Tradition, A History, will be published in September 2025. Thank you so much for joining us. We are so delighted to have you. Ethan, Avi, and Pam, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Francesca, for the invitation to take part in the panel. It's an honor and a privilege to be here and be joined by my distinguished co-panelists, Avi and Pam, as well as the fine speakers that you had in part one of this panel some weeks ago. So in my opening remarks here, I'm going to try to quickly address three different things. First is how we built the Antisemitism Education Initiative at Berkeley and what we tried to do with that. Second, I'm going to say a word about where definitions do and don't fit into our approach. And third, how we've adjusted in the past year since the events of October 7th and the ongoing war in Gaza and all of the repercussions from that on our campuses. So the Antisemitism Education Initiative, or the AEI, as we typically refer to it, really began in the late spring of 2019, at the end of my first year at Berkeley, in response to an incident at a student government meeting where I've written a little bit about this elsewhere in an essay I have coming out, but just very quickly, there was a sort of mocking of Zionism. Jewish students were told that they, quote, knew nothing about oppression. And for me, my first year at Berkeley, I and many other people on campus found it jarring. There was a video of it that was widely circulated. And my basic sort of starting point was that we could do better in terms of people knowing something about Zionism and knowing something about Jewish history, that we were not necessarily going to come to agreement about the Middle East conflict, that wasn't the goal, but that education could enable us to at least have more informed conversations. That helped to launch a collaboration between myself as a Jewish Studies faculty member, the head of something called the Chancellor's Advisory Committee on Jewish Student Life and Campus Climate, which is a really important entity at Berkeley that's helped to catalyze a lot of this work, and the Hillel director, Adam Naftali-Kalman, who's kind of become my partner in crime in a lot of this work since that time. And our initial goal was really to create educational opportunities in anti-Semitism that could in some way bring anti-Semitism into the lexicon of conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion on our campus, right? We hoped to partner with the folks in the DEI office. That's been a mixed bag, although over time we've made a lot of progress there. But that was sort of our initial goal, felt relatively modest. We created a module, a PowerPoint module that was to be available to all incoming freshmen in the fall, and a speaker series, 6 experts from around the world on anti-Semitism in the coming academic year. And we built upon relationships that had already begun to be established through the Chancellor's Advisory Committee that had been created a few years earlier with key stakeholders across the university. What we found was that what we were doing at that time was really quite unique. And before we knew it, sort of had mushroomed and taken on a life of its own. We created a series of trainings through that initial PowerPoint module for different groups across the university, the diversity, equity, inclusion staff, student affairs staff, other folks. We became the sort of go-to for a lot of senior administrators on questions about anti-Semitism as they arose, which was helpful in terms of going to people with expertise and people who really knew the university rather than to outside actors. And so we developed kind of a theory of the change that we were trying to bring that was really built around relationships, relying on local expertise, and also what we learned was a unique kind of collaboration between academics and folks at Hillel. I don't think that myself or my partner there realized at that time how unusual that was, and I think unfortunately how unusual it remains. And I think it's partly driven by circumstance where it can work and where it is harder, but it's been one of the strengths of the work that we've done. And it has given us a lot of credibility with multiple audiences. We also really came to conclude that what we were doing was philosophically centered in education, and that was what we had to lean into, and therefore to lean in to nuance, particularly when talking about subjects like the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and to try to create a kind of pluralistic learning environment where people would not think that they were walking into a Hasbara presentation, and understand that we were trying to make room for a lot of different perspectives and for the reality of scholarly debates and a wide spectrum of political opinions that would be respected. So we often point out emphatically that what we do is not advocacy and it's not activism, despite the importance of those in the overall landscape having to do with anti-Semitism. The contrast that I draw is advocacy and activism are about achieving a political result, and education is about achieving greater knowledge and understanding. And so while we work oftentimes with outside organizations like the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, we try to be very clear about what our mission is and where we think the lines are between education and advocacy. Many of you are familiar with the video that we created in 2021 called Anti-Semitism in Our Midst. It's an 11-minute sort of training primer, which a lot of campuses across the country have used. We're kind of overwhelmed by the response to that. And that has helped us to be able to kind of package in a more concise way a lot of our key ideas. And we were able to use a grant and some additional fundraising to hire a full-time program director for the Antisemitism Education Initiative, Greg Drinkwater, who's fantastic and has both an academic and community and sort of equity work background, who began in January of 2023. We've actually just hired a second full-time staff member as well. So in our work, we have never embraced a single definition of anti-Semitism, to move to the point about definitions. We draw from all of them in the video and in the way that we've had this evolving PowerPoint module that Greg now or myself occasionally use for trainings. We made that decision because the definitions are so politicized and polemicized, and we often think that the debates take us away from the focus on education. There has been a push at times from a small number of folks at Berkeley to adopt the IHRA definition. For some of the same reasons, I have been clear that I don't think adopting any single definition will be helpful to our campus. I have said before, and I've said it to my colleagues, that if we want to have an adoption of all three definitions as useful tools, I think that can be great. But part of what we have derived our strength from in the work of the AEI is that our academic colleagues know that we are serious and that we're not taking up a political position, that we're being rigorous. And I think that has to be sort of balanced with the fact that we're also always trying to think about the experiences of students and the experiences we're hearing about in the community, right? So while leaning into education, we're also doing a lot of listening sessions. We've always tried to be available to help interface with the administration for students. Greg does a lot of that work now. And so our openness to a variety of approaches has generally given us a lot of credibility, both within the community and across a pretty wide political and academic spectrum. The past year has been incredibly challenging on all of our campuses. Overall, I think we've been served remarkably well by the work that we had done in the preceding 4 years. The partnerships that we have built have been really crucial. with administrators and also among ourselves. Jewish Studies, Israel Studies, the Chancellor's Advisory Committee, the Antisemitism Education Initiative, Hillel, all of us were in touch multiple times a day for weeks on end after October 7th, and we were constantly triaging, creating spaces for Jewish students, creating spaces for education about Israel, responding to complaints and concerns, interfacing with the administration and leveraging those relationships successfully also to get greater police presence in certain contexts, to get the administration to speak out clearly about what was and was not allowed in the classroom in terms of politics, and eventually to persuade the chancellor to come through on something we had pushed for years, which was required anti-Semitism training for all incoming new students, all heads of registered student organizations, and all resident hall associates, RAs. And also, we had previously had entirely grant and gift funding for the support of the AEI. We finally got an allocation from the university for the next 5 years in support of the work of the AEI from university funding. We're actually expanding our efforts right now. We have something called the California Anti-Semitism Project, which works to support a lot of campuses across the state. And we're also in the beginning stages of creating a whole new set of resources, a group of TED Talk style presentations on themes in anti-Semitism, like the history of the blood libel, like anti-Zionism, like a whole range of topics. These will be 10 to 20-minute talks that can be used by scholars and by practitioners. And my fellow panelists might be hearing from us being asked to contribute to that. So, we're still dealing with a lot of nitty-gritty issues on our campus at the same time. We have had incidents this fall that have been troubling, but we are making progress, even if slowly, on those. And I would say it's only possible because of the groundwork that we laid in the early years before things actually became as challenging as they are now. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Ethan, and I will pick up. So I want to first of all thank you, Francesca, for the invitation to participate in this series, and just echo your comments that it's really an honor for me to appear on a panel with two experts in the field like Ethan Katz and Pamela Nadell. And I'm just as eager to share my thoughts today as I am to learn from my colleagues. The previous webinar with Ken Stern and David Feldman and Lori Lefkowitz on the IHRA, JDA, and Nexus definitions was excellent. So I want to thank you for organizing that as well. And if people here on the webinar have not had a chance to watch it, I would encourage you to go back and learn from that discussion on the origins of the definitions. So Francesca, as you mentioned, I'm in a new role at NYU, where I now serve as director of our Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism. My departmental home is Hebrew and Judaic Studies, where I also have an affiliation with the history department, and I serve as professor of Holocaust Studies. As you also noted, in my previous position at the University of Connecticut, where I served as director of our Center for Judaic Studies until January of 2024, I helped create this large-scale 7-week, 1-credit online class called Why the Jews Confronting Anti-Semitism. So you asked us to address whether or not our institutions have adopted definitions and whether there is support or opposition. I think the short answer is yes. While this preceded my time at NYU, there, of course, has been the adoption of different components of the IHRA definition, both with and without examples. And this has probably seen the most direct effect on the school's non-discrimination and anti-harassment policies, specifically in guidance and expectations on student conduct. Now, I want to say right off the bat that I actually have nothing to do in my role with drafting or enforcing such policies or questions connected to student conduct. I'm not a lawyer, nor have been involved with the writing of definitions like IHRA, JDA, or Nexus, as some of the previous panelists had been. So what I am is a historian and an educator. So I do, in fact, find the discussion around such questions to be quite revealing about the time in which we are living and about how anti-Semitism, or in quotation marks, anti-Semitism, is defined for the purposes of policy and how this might complicate the work we do as scholars to write about it both historically and in the present. More on this in a moment, but I'll just say a few words about our new center. I started as director of the new NYU Center for the Study of Antisemitism, or the CSA, and we really have just launched our first full year of activity this September. We've been busy over the past few months laying the foundation for our work at the CSA. And personally, as a historian who has studied manifestations of anti-Jewish hate and the diverse range of Jewish responses to them throughout the modern period, it's clear that we are living through an extraordinary historical moment that requires study, education, analysis, and a broader perspective in order for us to develop effective responses. And at NYU, I feel fortunate that we're in a unique position to build really a premier research institute, which will conduct research on manifestations of anti-Jewish hate throughout history and in the current moment, along with Jewish responses to them, in a space that will invite scholars, postdoctoral fellows, undergraduate, graduate students to research, write, and deliver public presentations within a scholarly community that has already begun to develop at our center, across our campus, and throughout our global network. And so I want to make clear that one of the jobs that we're trying to do here is build a center of engaged scholarship and education to convene the world's leading experts on the topic, and of course to build on the work that has already been done through the existing centers for the study of anti-Semitism, to gather the leaders of those centers together as well, and those new centers that are being created, and really to think seriously, as there is a great deal of investment now in the development of this field of anti-Semitism studies, what the implications of all of that work will be, especially as we think about the future, not only in the field of anti-Semitism studies, but also of Judaic studies, and more broadly, the implications of this at our universities and across the academy. So, of course, one of the, beyond sort of convening and training the next generation of students, one of the roles that we're taking on is organizing public programming based on education and scholarship. We had an opening conference that we held, sort of our first event in April of 2024. And there we promised to begin this academic year with public programs that would invite lecturers, speakers, support graduate student research, bring in visiting scholars, convene conferences, and more. And I won't go into the details, but you can see our website, studyantisemitism.org, and see that we've been quite busy over the last 2 months, and we have a number of exciting programs that are coming up, and we've been able to hire an assistant director, a research director, bring in a postdoc, and really do the work of beginning to build this center of programmatic activity. All right, so now that I've provided my CSA spiel, I'll just spend a few minutes responding to the questions of sort of how we apply these questions about definitions to our students, the lay public, to our broader academic community, especially in this post-October 7th moment. So let me just start with some personal reflections from my own teaching as a scholar who approaches from the fields of Jewish history and Holocaust studies perspective. And so I asked this question: are all of these definitions, which seem to be designed for implementation of policies or to develop legal categories to determine when discrimination against Jews as Jews or Jews as extensions of the state of Israel, when these constitute forms of anti-Semitism according to the definitions, I asked the question, are these useful as a category of historical analysis? So first of all, from a teaching perspective, as I mentioned before, we designed this large-scale class on anti-Semitism at UConn, and we're developing a similar class to be offered at NYU in the future. And on the one hand, I believe it's absolutely vitally important to teach this topic. On the other hand, I have these concerns. We don't want to simply present Jewish history as lachrymose history, as one persecution after the next, as a history of Jewish suffering. So in the class, before we defined and explained what anti-Semitism is, or examined manifestations of anti-Jewish hatred over time, or analyzed the evolution of the different definitions, we wanted to introduce students to who are the Jews, what is Jewish history and culture, and we're simply to ask this question: do we take an optimistic or pessimistic approach to Jewish history? I often use the joke, what's the difference between a Jewish pessimist and a Jewish optimist? The pessimist says things can't possibly get any worse, the Jewish optimist says, oh, yes, they can. And I think it's sort of an interesting way for us to think about how we approach the teaching of this history. And I genuinely have some real concern that for most students, the only class that they will ever take on Jewish culture, history, and civilization when they're on a college campus is through the lens of persecution, asking this question, why the Jews? So if we teach this history through the lens of stereotypes, then we present Jews as a monolithic whole, hated throughout time, and lose sight of Jewish diversity, of Jewish agency, of how Jews have assessed what the Jews, perceive to be dangerous at different points in time, and which strategies Jews as individuals and as a collective have developed to respond to those perceived threats. So if we present these definitions in a class on anti-Semitism, we might examine different manifestations of anti-Jewish hatred throughout time, throughout history, and understand each of them in their specific context. Why did Jew haters target Jews in those specific times and places? What other movements and ideologies and motivations might have they been connected with? Crucially, how did Jews in those places assess the nature of the threat and develop their responses accordingly? So in this sense, teaching definitions in a class like this would be most useful not in determining whether a manifestation of anti-Jewish hate in a given time or place was in fact, again in quotation marks to use the term anti-Semitic. Now I'm thinking of the 1879 term, or the term that's popularized by Wilhelm Marr at the time, but instead we can think about teaching the definitions more specifically useful in the 21st century section of the class, when we as historians might try to understand why Jewish groups, the Jewish community, political educational institutions seem to be especially concerned with questions of when anti-Israel sentiments or attacks on Israel cross the line into becoming attacks on Jews as Jews. Now, another problem with how we teach this, and I haven't resolved this challenge, is how do we devise a class on the history of anti-Semitism or the history of Jew hate without reinforcing an anachronistic notion of anti-Semitism as a force in the universe that emerges at different times in different places to be used by many different groups with different political ideologies for different purposes? And in this sense, we have both an educational challenge and a research challenge. And here I'm reminded of the article that David Engel has written, Away from a Definition of Anti-Semitism, where he argues that essentially there's, I'll quote from his argument, throughout the centuries, many people have behaved violently towards Jews. Many have depicted them verbally or artistically in derogatory fashion, agitated publicly for their subjection to legal discrimination, discriminated against them socially or privately, felt varying degrees of prejudice towards them or emotional revulsion from them. However, as Engel writes, no necessary relation among particular instances of violence, hostile depiction, agitation, discrimination, and private unfriendly feeling across space and time can be assumed. And so he asks us to, think seriously about why we use a socio-semantic convention of the 19th century sustained through the 20th for communal and political ends, not scholarly ones, as a category of analysis. And so I'll just end with this thought, and then I'm eager to continue this discussion and think more about the present moment in particular as we think about sort of the post-October 7th world that we live in. So just thinking, when Herzl imagined the Jewish state as a solution to the problem of anti-Semitism, he had one very specific group of anti-Semites in mind, whom he thought just the idea of the Jewish state would solve the problem of anti-Semitism once and for all, as he put it in Die Judenstadt. Now, obviously, we know that the Jewish state has not solved the problem of anti-Semitism. In fact, this is a whole area of research that I hope we can develop even further, those connections between the existence of Israel and anti-Jewish hate as it spreads all over the world. But Jewish hate has evolved too, and hatred of Jews in Israel has evolved, and anti-Zionism, as it might have existed in 1897 or 1939 or 2024, are different things. The most crucial difference being that we cannot deny the historical reality of the existence of Israel pre or post 1948. And so our notions as Jews of how best to respond to new forms of Jewish hate need to evolve as well. We live in a post-Holocaust world where the state of Israel exists. So manifestations of anti-Semitism may hold some similarities to previous examples, but they function in a different political, social, economic, technological environment. So the debate over definitions captures our very specific moment in time, but if I'm trying to teach or research the topic historically, I'm especially cautious about how I use the term as a category of analysis to write or teach that history. I'll stop myself there, and I'm eager to hear from Pam, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Avi. And thank you, Francesca, for organizing this very important series of 2 webinars. And it's such an honor to be here with Ethan and Avi, who are such experts in the field. So I want to start with the definitions, with the question about the definitions. And I'm actually thinking about something that Ken Stern said in the first session of this webinar series, where he said that none of the definitions should be used as speech code. And I've noticed that both Ethan and Avi have said that they also have concerns about adopting any of the definitions. And I share that position. As far as I know, American University, where I teach, has never had a serious conversation about adopting the IHRA definition. I remember being in a meeting with a number of senior administrators and some other colleagues. My colleagues and I felt that we should not be adopting the IHRA definition, which I think might have been the only one those administrators had even heard of. And maybe there are faculty on campus who disagree with us, but if they do, they have not spoken about it. And my experience, I should tell you a little bit about my experience with the IHRA definition. I actually testified in Congress for the first time in November of 2017, which was in a hearing that was about anti-Semitism on campus and was specifically about adopting Congress legislating the IHRA definition. And at that hearing, which included leaders from various Jewish organizations and people also from PEN America, and also Ken Stern was in that. And I should tell you, by the way, I ended up there because I'm local. I'm just a metro ride away from Congress. But I had taught about anti-Semitism, at least in long courses, long history courses, you know, the big overview surveys for a long time. And so I was willing to kind of wade into the waters, but I opposed Congress legislating the IHRA definition because it's a definition that changes over time. And what was most interesting to me in that very long hearing, where, by the way, one of the leaders from a Jewish organization said of me and of one other faculty member who was there, he said it was like inviting members of the Flat Earth Society to testify at a hearing about NASA. But what the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Bob Goodlatte of Virginia, said in that hearing was that he actually asked one of the heads of somebody from one of the Jewish organizations who'd been involved in creating the IHRA definition. He said, well, how can you legislate something that changes over time? And at that point in time, it was not legislated. It's still, the House has passed it, but it has not yet passed the Senate. So I agree with my colleagues. I do not recommend that our universities adopt a definition. And I have not expressed it as wonderfully as Avi did when he was talking about, you know, how anti-Jewish animosity has expressed itself in so many different ways over time. But I'm very well aware that anti-Semitism, the word, is not coined and not popularized until 1879. But that doesn't mean that we ignore explaining it, because honestly, most of the people I talk to have no idea what anti-Semitism is. So at American University, we developed in the Jewish Studies program a guide called Understanding Anti-Semitism, a guide for the American University community. The first thing I must say is that I got this idea from Professors Kirsten Vermeglish and Yael Aronoff at Michigan State University, where they had developed a guide for their campus. They had spent more than a year in conversations working on this guide. I didn't have time to do that. I was working on a book, but I got together a group of scholars, and in that guide, and let me emphasize, it's a guide. It's not been adopted as policy by the university. Some classes use it. My students have looked at it. I actually had my students workshop a version of the guide with me. It was requested by a senior administrator. Administrators saw it. And I know there are people on campus who don't like what we did, but they don't talk to me about it. So in that, we did create a short, concise working definition. This is the definition that that the people at Michigan State had done. And it says anti-Semitism is rhetoric, discrimination, prejudice, promotion of conspiracy theories, hostility, and/or violence against Jews or Jewish institutions. Expands a bit on the Jerusalem definition, has a few more words. But when I teach anti-Semitism, I teach a first-year seminar on anti-Semitism, we talk about multiple definitions in that class. Honestly, my personal favorite is attributed to Isaiah Berlin. An anti-Semite is someone who hates Jews more than absolutely necessary. And I see Ethan nodding. In my forthcoming book, Anti-Semitism in American Tradition, A History, I deliberately did not define the term. I thought about it. I worked around it for a while. And then let me emphasize why, or let me explain why I didn't do that. This is a book that's actually written for a wider public than just the academy. And while academics argue about the definitions, it's the academics who have actually written most of these definitions, spent a lot of time on the definitions. I think that we scholars are the ones who are most invested in crafting a definition. I would also say that for the wider public, they know the word anti-Semitism. They do not understand the word Judeophobia. They do not know the word anti-Judaism. And that that the definitions are being used for certain very specific purposes, either legal or political, and that I just wasn't going to wade into that territory. And as a colleague who read an earlier version of the manuscript said to me, he said he thought it was very smart that I didn't define it, because every example in this book, which covers 350 years, more than 350 years of anti-Jewish hate in America, is clearly anti-Semitic. What I want to say about something that Ethan and the panelist Lori Lefkowitz, who was there at the last session, have developed as part of the Nexus task force a kind of an expansion, a huge expansion on defining anti-Semitism, a campus guide to identifying anti-Semitism in a time of perplexity. And I think this is a very important and very powerful tool. It asks when a variety of terms applied to Israel, like Zionist, the BDS movement, when they cross the line to anti-Semitism. But I am conscious that Professor Lefkowitz in the last webinar said the goal of doing this guide was to talk about when events, to emphasize how events are context dependent. I will note that the last time I was in Congress, last December, 2 university presidents kept saying in answers to questions, it depends on the context, and they're not in presidents of those universities any longer. So the question is, and maybe Ethan and I can talk somewhat about this, is how do you measure intent? How do you, and also, what does it mean when speaker's intent does not correspond to listeners' reception? And I want, in the last 2 minutes or so that I have, I want to say something very specifically about what drew me into the book that I am literally wrapping up within the next couple of weeks. And I began, I think going to Congress in October 2017 made me think about writing about anti-Semitism in a way that I had not anticipated. And of course, that going to Congress in 2017 was the result of that hearing had been called in part because of the explosion of anti-Semitism at the Unite the Right rally that August. Then in October of 2018, on 10/27, 11 Jews were massacred at worship in the deadliest attack on American soil at Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue. And as historians, we were taken by surprise. As historians of the American Jewish experience, we were shocked. The American Jewish Historical Society, and this is pre-Zoom, so I didn't go to New York, which is where it's located, but they somehow brought us into the room, and we began talking about what had we missed. And it's really a response to what Professor Patt was saying, because on the one hand, yes, we had really been teaching that look at what had happened in American Jewish history. Jews had, gotten rid of the quotas had disappeared. Jews had moved into the mainstream of American life. And yet, how had we gotten to this point? And so I will say that I started working on this book a long time ago. I signed the contract for it 2.5 years ago. It's not something that I expected would become as relevant in the wake of what happened on October 7th. But it is a theme of American Jewish history. And the challenge, as Professor Pat said, is how do we write about this, talk about this, present it publicly, while also knowing that this is only one aspect of the historic experience of the Jewish people. So I'll end there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ethan, Avi, and Pam, for your very thoughtful remarks, very rich. We have, let me just unpin, able to. There are so many threads that I would like to explore in the next segment of our conversation. And one concern that I've heard from every one of you is the desire not to settle on one definition, and the important distinction between the research and the educational mission that we have as scholars and the work of administrators and policymakers. What I'm hearing is a certain divide between the mandate that we have as educators and the interest on the part of administrators, students sometimes, parents oftentimes, to find a clear definition that can guide them through uncertain waters in troubling times. Do you find at your institutions that there is this kind of divide? And in Ethan, your comments on the establishment of the Antisemitism Initiative at Berkeley are really telling, very inspirational as a model on how to move forward. How do we bridge that divide if you find that there is such a divide at your institution?
Do you want to just go in the order we went in before?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that I think, yes. So the divide between sort of scholarly, the core mission of universities, which I think we hopefully all agree is to promote education and scholarship and to build a certain kind of intellectual environment, at the same time that we think it's fundamental that everyone feel physically safe and welcomed, not always comfortable. I think Ken Stern said in your first session that if you walk around comfortable all the time in a university, you've probably wasted a lot of time and a lot of money. And I basically agree with that. We have a lot of talk about safety, so I feel it's important to define what we mean. But sort of within those parameters, that's something often seen as separate from the interests of specific communities politically, outside but connected communities to the university, be they the Jewish community, the African-American community, the local community writ large, all kinds of different communities that have different relationships to the university. We tend to perceive that they have different interests than just education and scholarship. And I don't think there's any way around that reality, right? I personally think I've had a lot of chance. I chair the Chancellor's Advisory Committee on Jewish Life, which has a purview that really in many ways is community facing, and that is in many ways about supporting students and helping them interface with administration, helping support their communal needs. I also now direct the Center for Jewish Studies, and those are different hats. And I've had a lot of chance to think about what it means to wear those hats at the same time and the challenges of that, and trying to be clear about which hat I'm wearing in which meetings sometimes. I think that we're at a moment where Jewish studies should be thinking about, in some ways, redefining our relationship to the community, right? Historically, Jewish studies was born in a moment where politics were fundamental to what the whole idea of Jewish studies were about. It was was inseparable from the mission in terms of integration of Jews in 19th century Europe, right? We also had a long period where Jewish studies was deeply connected to a lot of traditional Jewish institutions of learning that were, strictly speaking, non-academic in the sense we now speak of universities. There was a big rebellion against that of sorts in the 20th century, and the creation of all these positions in Jewish studies that ensconced us, especially in the American Academy. And there was a long time of resistance to doing things that felt too much like they were shaped by the community or shaped by politics. All healthy in many ways. But, as a colleague reminded me in a meeting last year, in many ways, Jewish studies is an ethnic studies type of field. And we accept the idea in African American studies and in Latino studies and in Asian American studies that the relationship to the community is fundamental to what a lot of centers do. And it's even fundamental sometimes to scholarship and teaching. And so I'm not suggesting the pendulum swing all the way back, but I think we should be acknowledging that those tensions are real. They're fundamental to what we do. We shouldn't run away from trying to sort of find a way to bridge that gap. The last thing I'll just say is I think we can't really have this conversation productively right now without acknowledging that part of what this tension is about is also, and I speak hopefully in careful words, but a power differential, right? That is, we're having a conversation about anti-Semitism that is inseparable from conversations about anti-Zionism and Israel and events in Israel and Palestine. And we have the benefit, in many instances, of very strong American Jewish institutions that are trying to support that work. We have disagreements with them. Sometimes we have fierce arguments with them. We have Jewish studies, as at this point, a substantially established field with many, many endowed positions. And we are facing administrations, and we're working in places where Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim students are also facing intense discrimination and challenges, and they often don't have the same level of institutional support that we do. And so when we think about the relationship, I think, between the community and our obligation as educators, we have to also be conscious of that power differential and think about how our focus on anti-Semitism has to be done with a certain kind of care and rigor that also opens up to the needs of those communities and those students as well.
Thank you, Ethan. You raised so many important issues for us to discuss, and I'll try to pick up on some of those threads and also respond to Francesca's initial question. I mean, I think one of the issues that I've been thinking about a lot that you just raised, Ethan, is sort of the place of Judaic studies or Jewish studies on our campuses, and sort of how our role in the academy has come to be, how it's changed over time. And we are very much in this critical moment where we have to think very seriously about the implications of sort of the investment in anti-Semitism studies, the creation of these centers, these educational initiatives, the political tensions that we're talking about, and how that will affect our broader relationships on campus, but also sort of the relationships that our departments, our programs have with the Jewish communal institutions off campus. And I think, there's a lot it's probably a whole other webinar for us to discuss and to unpack, but I think you're right that we have to be very aware of some of these questions. And I'll just say that one of the issues that I think sort of is brought to the fore, one of the tensions is sort of this distinction between scholarship and activism. Or sort of an academic conversation that we might have as scholars, where I just went through sort of weighing all the questions that come up in my head about whether I can find this useful as a category of analysis for historical terms or in my teaching, where I think Pam sort of made the analogy about Flat Earth Society and NASA, right? Like, it might sound like completely disconnected and out of touch from very real world issues that are going on. And I think to a certain extent, we have to be aware of sort of that disconnect. And in fact, the fact that we might be speaking completely different languages. So we're having a conversation now about the definitions, about policy implications. And I just went through a whole thing about sort of how I'm not sure as a scholar whether I found these definitions to be useful, but at the same time, we have to be very aware of how the research that I might be promoting or the scholarship that I might be promoting will be used for the creation of these types of definitions that have very clear policy implications. So it's like we can't sort of pretend that there's not an artificial divide. That exists, and we have to be very aware of those implications. And I'm constantly wrestling with this sort of scholar-activist thing, and I do not think of myself as an activist. I worry that activism is going to affect the ability for me to do real scholarship. I worry about the political sort of these political forces affecting, you know, my ability to do serious work and do serious writing and do serious teaching, and sort of trying to always keep that at bay and have my work not affected by that, or be aware of it, how it affects my work, and also have my classroom be a space where we're open to free and open exchange of ideas, and we don't shut anything down. And like, that's what we should be doing. That's what we should be doing on campus. You made the point about sort of safety, you know, and this is like a very, very current thing about our students. And I think we have to think really seriously about, on the one hand, what does it mean? You know, as I think you alluded to, or Pam alluded to, about Ken's comment about, you know, we don't want our students, if students just spend all their time on campus worrying about feeling safe, that they're not going to have been challenged or engaged in a meaningful or productive way. I had a student, I've never had this before, but I did have a student email me this semester thanking me for sort of creating a safe space within a Holocaust studies class. And I thought, okay, like that, I'm glad that you feel safe in my classroom, but at the same time, that's probably not sort of the point of the history that I'm trying to teach you right now. A couple of other things, and then I'll let Pam jump in, is one of the concerns that I have about sort of the definitions and using it as a category of analysis is that we have to be really precise in what we're describing and what we're defining. And a lot of my work as a historian has focused less on perpetrator motivation. So in this case, it's sort of thinking about why do anti-Semites hate Jews, or what is the intent, or what sort of context in which that hatred developed. Most of my historical research focuses on Jewish responses, and I'm actually much more interested in my own work in sort of how do Jews assess the nature of the threat that confronts them? What strategies do they develop in order to respond to those threats? And so when Pam was speaking, I was thinking about sort of this question of like, what are the threats around apropos this discussion of safety, and what are the effective strategies that might be developed in order to respond to them? And I think in terms of being precise and specific, this is where I have these concerns about, if we're talking about the Charlottesville Unite the Right, Jews will not replace us, or we're talking about the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, and we're talking about very real, clear and present dangers and threats to Jewish life in the United States, that is motivated by a different type of hate, a different rationale, a different ideology that will necessitate different strategies in order to effectively respond to it. If it has to do with sort of alliances with law enforcement, it have to do with types of educational strategies that are employed. We could talk about the strategies. That's different than sort of a definition of anti-Semitism that identifies a threat post-October 7th from sort of radical Islam, or from terrorist groups that are sort of motivated by the Palestinian struggle and fighting Israel. And to a certain extent, right, those are different ideologies that are motivating that hatred. And I think it's actually helpful for us to think about, okay, if they're different, what strategies might we develop in order to respond to them differently? And this is where I have a concern about sort of creating one category that says it's all the same. No, it's not all the same. Perhaps it would be effective for us to develop different strategies to respond differently to different threats as they might appear. All right, I'll stop myself there and turn it over to Pam.
All right, thanks. So I'm going to respond to a couple of things. Ethan made a really important point about the power differential on campus. And in that brilliant rapid survey of the development of Jewish studies from the early 19th century in Europe all the way down to the 21st century, what he was showing us was how Jewish studies emerged in the American Academy, the result of a project initiated in Germany in the early 19th century, but that really reached its fruition in the United States, and it really begins to grow not until the 1960s. And so it grows as a result of the emergence of ethnic studies, especially Black studies in the academy, as it was called in that early era. But it was, even when it was growing in the academy then, it was actually an academic communal partnership, because as Ethan said, lots of Jewish studies programs are extremely well endowed. They have endowed chairs, they have endowed centers, and they are extremely well endowed because the community endowed them. And I think as a result of that, and sort of wearing my hat from my years as the president of the Association for Jewish Studies, is I've always been aware that Jewish studies academics have a wider responsibility. And we know that Palestinian studies, Arab American studies, they did not make the same kinds of investment in the universities. So while we have endowed positions and we have established centers, they don't. And there's a real power differential on the campus among the faculty and the students in those two areas. And so I'm aware of that, but I want to use that to bridge to what Avi was talking about when he was talking about, the difference between scholarship and activism. And I don't think being a public intellectual is necessarily about activism. So when I testified in Congress with the university presidents, and I was invited there because I had, by this point in December of 2023, I had developed and written quite a bit about anti-Semitism in America. That was playing a role. It's my role as an educator, but playing a role to educate to a wider audience beyond the campus. And that does require a different kind of education, a way of speaking to an audience that is not going to look at our footnotes and is not going to do the deep dive into the tremendous concerns we have about, like, as Avi quoted David Engel's article, I'm thinking of Jonathan Udikin's work, but I think I think, Avi, this happened on your campus when you ran at UConn, a course for 1,600 students. It's something that you want to get this out, and you want to get it out widely to our students. You want to get this information out widely to the United States, to America, and even beyond. And this brings me to a concern that I have about not just anti-Semitism on the campus, but what is happening in terms of the way intellectual life is being, I say Jews are being put in a virtual ghetto at this point. The writers who have most recently said that they want to boycott anything to do with cultural life in Israel. Before that, there was a list of fiction writers who, because of what they had posted, were identified as either pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian. And I am, as somebody who reads a great deal of fiction, and it's actually judged fiction book prizes, I am deeply, deeply disturbed by the effort, not just to shut down the conversation on campus, but to shut down the conversation in cultural and intellectual life that is putting Jews into a ghetto. I'll stop there.
Let me ask one more question, and then we're going to open the discussion to members of the public. And it really is a segue from Pam, your last comment, which is, how do we move from here? I'm curious to know which constituencies on your campuses have mobilized in the wake of October 7th to think about these issues, to think about the definitions, or to simply think about the threat of anti-Semitism. And how do we move from there in a way that is honest and takes into consideration the power differentials that you so eloquently talked about? And so what are some of the strategies that we can implement to envision a future where open conversation is possible, honest conversation is possible, and at the same time, we keep in mind the educational the educational mandate that we all have.
All right, maybe since you were picking up on me, maybe I'll start and then pass it along to Ethan and Avi. As a historian, one of the things that I have learned is that across American history, American Jews developed a playbook of responses to anti-Semitism. And Avi said he's always really interested in the question of Jewish responses. And there are many, many groups at the moment responding to anti-Semitism. Avi's new center is actually a reflection of, I'm assuming, is a reflection of that response. And it's happening in the community. I'm not only thinking about campus. It's happening in the community. But what is clear is that American Jews, I mean, since we're focusing on the US, but Jews around the world, this is not just a Jewish problem. If it were just a Jewish problem, in May of 2023, the White House would not have issued a document about combating anti-Semitism in the United States, a document based on conversations with 1,000 stakeholders. And I imagine, I know I was involved in the conversations leading up to that, and it's possible that my colleagues were as well. And that the only way to respond is to get allies. Now, where are those allies on campus? Maybe some academic departments, not all by any means. Obviously, building allyships with administrators. Ethan talked about the important work he did at Berkeley, working with the diversity, equity, and inclusion officers. Very important forums for this, but it is painstaking, time-consuming work. I'll stop there.
So I'll just sort of put a few things out there. I mean, I think that one thing that is a really important part of the discussion that is even clearer after the last year has to really just be talked about in an open and intellectually serious way is something that Pam alluded to earlier, which is the tension between intention and impact on issues of anti-Semitism, right? I mean, if we look at on my campus, right, there's been a major pro-Palestinian mobilization since October 7th. And there's been the same kinds of debates about slogans and placards at a lot of those rallies that there has been on many campuses, right? And I'm happy to get into some of the weeds on it. I've spoken about it elsewhere. But I think the point, we take something, one of the ones that's probably been discussed the most, right? From the river to the sea, Palestine will all be free, right? That's a slogan that lands in a very, jarring and painful way for a lot of Jewish students. It sounds to many Jewish students like, at best, a call for the end of the state of Israel, and at worst, a call for the elimination of Jews from that space between the rivers and the sea. My colleague Maha Nassar, a Palestinian scholar, has actually written about the history of that slogan and its complexity for Palestinians, and I think pretty persuasively arguing that those are not necessarily at all the meaning ascribed for Palestinian nationalists classically to that slogan. I also think it's safe to say most of our students have little idea what they're saying with some of these slogans. My colleague Ron Hastner did a survey that was published in the Wall Street Journal last year, which river and which sea, and a very high percentage of people could not identify either one, which I think should trouble us. But the point that I want to make is just, these slogans are usually not one thing, right? And impact is where we've gone on a whole host of issues of exclusion, right? Listen to the people in the group that is affected, right? What is their experience, regardless of intention, right? I think we can't have absolutes on either end of that spectrum, but we should be caring about how Jewish students are experiencing these rallies. We should take that seriously as much as we take other experiences of pain and exclusion from students seriously. And at the same time, these students should learn something about what these slogans can mean to other political actors in other times and places, not because they're necessarily going to change each other's minds, right? But when we have these kinds of tensions, when we have tensions over, what's referred to as Nakba Week or Yom HaAtzmaut, what I always push administrators to do is these students need to get in a room. The student who's organizing the event needs to explain what it means to them, and the student who's upset by the event needs the opportunity to explain what it means to them. And they may still go on with the event. They may modify parts of it. The student who's upset may not change their mind, but they would at least learn a lot rather than assuming sort of the worst about each other in either, carrying forth a certain event or a certain slogan or certain symbol or objecting to it. So I feel like that conversation is one that we really need to push people to have because it's not in some ways it's an irresolvable tension, right? I also just something that I've spent a lot of time in the last year working on is a dialogue initiative at Berkeley called the Berkeley Bridging Fellowship, which I created with a Muslim colleague and with two amazing facilitators. And it's an amazing group of students we have in there. They're really talking across difference a lot, and that is the kind of thing that I think enables us to raise these issues also in a serious, rigorous, and sustained way. To Pam's point about exclusions in intellectual life, unfortunately, there's been tremendous opposition to this from a few colleagues and from certain student organizers on the pro-Palestinian end. And I've learned recently that unfortunately a significant amount of that opposition is crystallized around a caricature of me, right? As a Palestinian-hating Zionist, right? People who are familiar with my work, things I've said on the record, can't imagine that there are many folks in the Jewish community who think I've been much too empathetic toward Palestinians. But that's the nature of this moment that we're in. And I had to conclude at a certain point that some of the opposition couldn't be totally separated from the fact that I'm a visible leader in the Jewish community. I wear a kippah and these things. And so, that makes the effort to reach across harder in a way. I would say, but all the more important that we continue to try.
Thanks, Ethan. So I'll just add a couple of thoughts on this, and then we can open up the discussion. So, Pam, a couple of things. Your comment about sort of being public intellectuals has me thinking broadly about our role sort of in society, and I think ultimately we are in the education business, right? That's our field. That's how we're categorized. I think for text purposes, that's probably how we're defined as well. And I think there is sort of this, I was joking before about the optimists and the pessimists, but I think there is this sort of optimistic belief in the power of education. And I think we're living in a time where the work that we do is really under threat. We have to be very aware of the danger of the time that we're in, of the field that we're in, of that education and the educational work that we do is actually quite vulnerable. And so I want to lean into this idea of sort of using the power of education to signal an openness to new ideas, to signal our willingness to build bridges, to engage in dialogue, as you were talking about, Ethan, to sort of confront the extremes that exist in our society, the ways in which social media and political forces drive people to hold much more extreme viewpoints, to have sort of black and white thinking. And let's face it, I mean, our role as educators, we were talking about sort of nuance and complexity and asking people to live in those gray areas. And I still have this optimistic belief that the vast majority of folks are open to the free and open exchange of ideas. That yes, it's the extreme voices on either side that make the most noise. But when we taught this huge class at UConn, I sort of had this feeling that 90% of the students in there are sort of very open to free and open exchange of ideas, just want to learn. That's why they're coming to take our classes. And so it's a tremendous opportunity for us to be able to educate, to use the power of education, to ask folks to wrestle with complexity, to think about nuance, to think about sort of these difficult questions. And ultimately, I think sort of in terms of moving forward, the work that we can do, one of the most important things that we can do is to elevate and promote those more moderate voices, to signal an openness, to look at complexity, to kind of push out the extremes that are dividing our world, dividing our societies. I think if we think about Israel, and we haven't talked about Israel, but I think it's sort of, if we think about going forward, it's the same thing has to happen. We have to promote sort of those moderate voices that have an openness and a willingness to have a free and open exchange of ideas. I think the dangers of extremism are really overpowering at this moment. But at the same time, sort of there is this optimism that, we have to trust, hopefully, in human nature. And even as I say this, as somebody who studies the Holocaust, as somebody who studies anti-Semitism, we can end up being very pessimistic about human nature. But I think we're in the education business because there is some optimism that we can educate folks, we can make a difference, and hopefully that will move us forward.
Thank you all. Let's move to some of the questions from the public at home. I want to start with a question from Marian Kaplan. She says, I thank Ethan for mentioning Palestinian students. I worry that focusing only on anti-Semitism and not on racisms will not be effective and will seem like special pleading. Would anybody want to?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in first. Hi to Marian. It's great to hear from you. I'm going to mention something that I just did in Chicago, which I thought was an extraordinary symposium. It was in the theater department, and the organizers brought two one-person, one-act plays. The playwright actors presented. One was called #Charlottesville by the extraordinary Priyanka Shetty, which will have its world premiere in Washington, D.C. in March. So it's still a workshop version. And the other play was titled Otto Frank, and Roger Gouverneur Smith, and extraordinary actor, and who typically, by the way, he got to writing this because he was performing a play that he'd written about Rodney King, and then in Amsterdam, and he went to the Anne Frank house, and he talked about this with the students in the class we met. And I was the academic anchor in the symposium, and I talked about how, drawing upon Eric Ward's work, drawing upon the work of our colleague Magda Tedder, what is the underpinnings, the way in which anti-Semitism is an underpinning of white nationalism and racism. And I agree with you. I think that this conversation needs to happen more. Obviously, it's something when I teach anti-Semitism, but it's a freshman seminar with just 19 students, something that I talk about, but it is something that we have, not only do we not bring that point out often enough, but also thinking of what Ethan has done at Berkeley, it is something that we need to show those who are engaged in reformulating diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts at the moment, as Ted Mitchell, the head of the American Council on Education, talks about DEI 2.0. And I think that this needs to be a theme that becomes part of DEI 2.0.
I'll just say something quickly. Nice to see you, Marian. Thanks for the shout out and the question. Yeah, so for us, it's always been fundamental that we didn't want Jews to stick out like a sore thumb, so to speak. We didn't want there to be anti-Semitism education, but not other kinds of education on these issues, and that has at times been a question on campus. So last year, when we were sort of in a new push for these trainings, we repeatedly pushed for anti-Semitism and Islamophobia trainings as two areas where students were not getting the education that they needed, and there were clearly acute issues on campus in our current moment and our current climate. people who know my work know that I have written a lot about Islamophobia, so I genuinely think it's important from a range of perspectives. But also, we wanted it to be clear that we were not asking for something for Jewish students that we didn't think that other students also needed, and that we were very cognizant of other vulnerabilities. So yeah, I think that that's right. I think, I mean, Eric Ward's work is really important. We have brought him a couple of times. Yeah, the more we can think about this in conversation with other isms, so to speak. Jonathan Judekin's new book, Critical Theories of Anti-Semitism, is a wonderful resource for scholars, and I think something that we would all do well to think about how to leverage that in practical ways in some of our teaching and some of our programming, because he brings really a wealth of intellectual resources there and perspectives. So yeah, but I also, I mean, I'll go back to what I said before, right? I mean, all the more so given the power differentials, given this moment, given the really terrible situation on the ground in the Middle East, and the complexity of our student populations, that we have to really avoid, as much as we're all spending a huge amount of our time and energy on anti-Semitism, full stop, we have to avoid sounding myopic and thinking that our concerns and our problem are the only ones that are bubbling up from the current context.
I'll just add two thoughts on this. So first of all, hi Marian. I can't see you, but nice to hear from you here. And Marian was one of my advisors when I was at NYU as a PhD student. So it's great to be in the same Zoom space. And I'll just say that sort of a couple of thoughts. I mean, I think we've all sort of mentioned the same folks who are doing work in these areas where we're looking sort of intersections between anti-Semitism, racism, other forms of hate. So Eric Ward, Jonathan Judekin, Magda Tater. I mean, I think their work has shown sort of how fruitful and productive it can be to sort of look at this from a broader context of the hate studies lens, or sort of the intersections between that. But now I'll just step back for a second and sort of think about this again, sort of as a Jewish historian, and say that one of the interesting things for us to think about in terms of our approaches to this is it does, again, come back to this question of, do we fundamentally, or do Jews, as they sort of think about how to think about this, or the strategies that they can employ in order to respond to it, are they optimistic or pessimistic about the Jewish ability to have a fruitful and productive existence with other groups in the diaspora, so to speak? And so, again, I think this affects sort of like our political approaches. So if we're optimistic about it, then it makes sense to form alliances, to look at this sort of through intersections, to think about sort of the connections, obviously, between racism, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism. And I think it's a very productive and effective strategy, especially in the present day, especially for Jews, living in the United States. I think one of the things that's so striking, just as an aside, is like this survey data that is showing sort of the stark divide between where American Jews are by and large in terms of who would be best for their future in the election next week, and what Israeli Jews think would be best for American Jews. And there's that is a very telling sort of divide in terms of how you assess the world and what sort of most productive. And if you are pessimistic about the Jewish future to live in the diaspora, then sort of that might lead you to certain conclusions, but it also affects the work that we do and how we focus on anti-Semitism, either within conversation or not, to these other isms. The last thing that I just want to add to this, that I think 100%, I think it's important for us to, as Marian suggested, elevate, and listen to and signal a willingness to engage in conversation with Palestinian students, obviously pro-Palestinian voices. I think, ironically, on many of our campuses where we don't have Palestinian studies departments, the people who are doing the work where these conversations are taking place are very often centers for Israel studies, right? So that is like an irony that we have to think about. However, in many cases, our colleagues who want to have these conversations, want to engage with their Palestinian colleagues, want to raise difficult questions about Israel and the Palestinians, are essentially boycotted by by pro-Palestinian voices on campus, or by Students for Justice in Palestine or Faculty for Justice in Palestine. And I say it's ironic because those are the very people who are signaling a willingness and an openness to engage in these conversations. So even as we're sort of saying, yes, we should elevate these voices, we should engage in these conversations, we should signal a willingness to sort of have moderation and open and free and open exchange of dialogue. At the same time, what is counterproductive to that is boycotts. That is something that we at the same time have to work against, exactly as Pam was talking about cultural boycotts, political boycotts, academic boycotts. It is illiberal and it is counterproductive to exactly what we're trying to do. So, I think David Feldman in the previous session talked about walking and chewing gum at the same time, like holding two contradictory ideas in your head at the same time. That's exactly what we have to be doing, like signaling willing and openness, but then saying the strategy of boycott is not effective for us to have free and open exchange and dialogue and open exchange of ideas.
Let me pick up, maybe we have time for one last question from Ilantro, and there's a couple of questions in the Q&A that suggest a sort of an exceptionalism when it comes to questions about Zionism and Israel. So Ilantro asks, is it correct to view Israel as exceptional in the self-imposed or community-generated restraint concerning other communities, ethnic, national, religious, behavioral? If so, why? Or is the freedom of speech in the academy absolute and concerns of Jews/Israelis exaggerated and inappropriate? So I think this question addresses the issue of when anti-Zionism may blur into anti-Semitism and concerns about that distinction. Would anybody, Ethan?
I mean, I'll say, I guess I'll take a stab at it. I mean, right, it's a huge question. I mean, I think it varies also from one campus to another, exactly where the conversation is and what the campuses are doing, right? What's been interesting for me to see is, on my campus, it was very clear the first meeting that we had 4 days after October 7th, that free speech protections were going to mean huge amounts of stuff that was already happening was going to be not actionable, right? Students are already complaining. They are feeling threatened by this. Well, that's not technically a threat. You're upset. We understand why. I'm sitting in a room with somebody who's a former member of the IDF, who's a university staff member, somebody else who makes half their life in Israel, who's a lawyer, and they're both laying out really specifically, like, here's where you actually have what counts as a threat that is actionable, and it's very narrow and it has to be direct. It has to be directed with a time frame, a specific person or group of people, and all these other things over here that people are upset about. We can try to support them other ways. So on my campus, overall, the protections for free speech have, in my view, been extremely robust. There are rules. There are what are called time, place, and manner rules, something I've learned a great deal about over the last year, more than I ever wanted to. Didn't go to law school for a reason, but there these are rules about how we can regulate speech at institutions, and they are. I mean, public institutions can actually do a lot with those rules. Private institutions can do a lot more in terms of what restrictions are on them. And what I've realized is that a lot of private institutions have been regulating speech much more. They've been clamping down on speech on websites. They've been clamping down on certain kinds of signs and expression in ways that, I personally believe that unless there are genuine safety issues, we should be protecting a very wide range of speech. Universities sometimes have an obligation to talk about speech that contravenes our values. And we have at times urged our leadership to do that. And our chancellor just put out a video doing that recently, talking about speech that seems to promote violence, like some of the speech defending or celebrating October 7th that recurred on the anniversary of October 7th on our campus, right? But I think what I realize is on my campus, I'm more worried that the university be willing to speak about certain kinds of expression that contravenes our values or that is anti-Semitic. And people on other campuses are sometimes really worried that accusations of anti-Semitism are effectively being demonized to create new regulations that are genuinely stifling elements of pro-Palestinian speech. So I think that variation is really important to recognize. And I think, I mean, this is just a tension that we have to acknowledge and try to navigate. And this is where I think opportunities for bridging of some sort become really important. And being as honest as we can about the complexity of developing those groups, right? I mean, I'm very much sympathetic to what Avi just talked about in terms of illiberalism, in terms of people being discouraged or declined opportunities for engagement. And as I alluded to, I've confronted that myself. But in the work of building our initiative, one of the things that I've learned also is just how dialogue, bridging, these things have a complicated history for Palestinians that looks very different than it does for us. And there are a lot of these initiatives that get developed without Palestinian voices being consulted. Now, it's been a frustrating experience in our case because a number of folks who were asked to contribute over and over again just declined to do so. But we did work really hard to have the widest possible range of people be consulted and to really take into account that complicated experience of Palestinians with dialogue and the way we structured things. And I think sometimes we think, I've opened a space for dialogue, I've opened a space for conversation. Why won't people come into that space? But if we define the terms of that space and we do it without a lot of outreach, then it's even less likely that we're going to actually bring in diverse voices.
I'll just add to that what Avi talked about and what Ethan's just talked about also happened at my university. Even when senior administrators tried to get pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian voices in conversation, the way it was done on some other campuses, there were no partners, and that the real initiatives for that came from Jewish studies and Israel studies faculty, and that is deeply distressing. I would also add, in warm regards to Ilan, I would also add that that we don't really have free speech on campus. And what nobody seems to remember is that I can point to a case that happened at Oklahoma State University. I know this happened on my own campus, where a professor actually used the N-word, read the N-word out loud in a 19th or 20th century text where it appears. And then at one case, there was calls for that person to be fired. And on my own campus, I know of faculty who have been called by the provost's office because, as Ethan was saying, there are things that we are allowed to say technically in terms of free speech, but that we are not supposed to say because of our values. And the issue at the university is that there are certain things that we cannot say because of our values, but there are certain things that because of the diversity of values on campus, we've become allowed to say. And I know at Avi's school, Zionist has now been included in the code of language and student conduct code, that when it is used a certain way, it is weaponized and it is seen as a code word for Jew hatred. So this is an ongoing project, but the bottom line is, as Avi said before, the calls for BDS, the shutdown of any kind of conversation, while everybody right now is talking about promoting civic dialogue, if you don't have partners on the other side, you're not going to ever have civic dialogue around Israel or anti-Semitism.
I'll just add briefly, and I think Ethan and Pam both made excellent points on that, and I'm thinking it's nice to see that Ilan is here as well. Thinking back on the question about sort of, I think the question had to do with sort of, is Israel treated as an exceptional case on campus, or and if so, why that might be, and sort of wrestling with this question, and I'm thinking, of cases of comparison. And one of the things that pops to mind, of course, from recent memory is sort of that actually might be an apt comparison. So we're dealing with the aftermath of October 7th. We're dealing with the fact that we have an ongoing conflict on our campus in Israel-Palestine, but also on our campuses as well. This sort of highlights a focus, exacerbates it. But I think historically, we can also see that there's been a disproportionate focus on Israel-Palestine on campuses comparatively, sort of for years and years. And I'm thinking about sort of 2022 and Russia's invasion of Ukraine and sort of academic responses to that as well. And I don't, this is a call maybe for somebody to do some research on this, but I think there's an interesting point of comparison to think about, right? Like on the one hand, there were many calls to boycott Russia, to boycott Russian institutions, to boycott Russian academic exchanges, I think, as well, as sort of a show of solidarity with Ukraine. On the other hand, I think that one of the areas, probably if we think about global affairs, that we need the greatest area of study and continued research on is specifically on Russia. And one of the things that we're dealing with now since the fall of the Iron Curtain and sort of the end of Sovietology is I think for years there's people haven't been studying Russia, and so this is just sort of a plea for that. There actually is an important role for us to play in terms of academic investment, and again, a plea against sort of like calls for boycott and shutting down the possibility of exchange of ideas, and that usually you end up hurting the people who are the most moderate voices when you boycott them in those exchanges. And the last thing that I'll say is, I do think, and I was thinking about sort of these as a parent of somebody who, as a parent of a child, one who's an undergraduate at Tufts now, another one who is going through the college application process right now as a senior in high school. There is so much noise out there about, what campuses are safe for Jewish students. There's so much anxiety on the part of Jewish parents. You have Facebook groups organizing against this. You have the ADL issuing report cards, right? Like, and we could sort of chuckle about whether or not, but I think one of the things that is quite interesting that we can see as like a variable in all of this is that by and large, I think the existence of academic programs for the study of Jewish history or Judaic studies, or these anti-Semitism study centers or whatever we're talking about, are generally not taken into most calculations as to like whether or not a place is safe for the Jews and safe for Jewish students. And I think that is like a serious thing that we have to wrestle with and think about, this disconnect between sort of the work that we're doing as academics and perceptions of these campuses. Just talking about sort of within the broader Jewish community. And, we have to wrestle with and think about the implications of that and think about sort of, to Pam's point about being public intellectuals and doing outreach and sort of signaling that these, these kids, when they get to these campuses, I would hope that they would enroll in our classes and hopefully learn from us. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, on this note, we have reached the end of our time. I want to thank you all for what was a very thoughtful conversation that also, I think, made very clear the work that we have ahead of us. And again, thank you, Ethan, Katz, Avinoam, Patt, and Pamela, Nadell. Thank you all to the people. Thank you, the people at home. Have a great rest of your day. Shabbat Shalom.